Hey everyone, welcome. Come on in and take your seat. Shavua Tov to everyone. Good week. And we'll get started in just 1 minute. So please get settled in and maybe finish up anything that you've been preoccupied with until now in your Sunday routine. Really wonderful to have such a wonderful response to this program. See so many folks. Um, and we'll begin in just a few seconds. And actually, why don't we just begin right here? Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Margolius. I'm Vice President for Faculty and Program at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. I'm just here to welcome everyone. People, I'm sure, continue to arrive and invite you to take a moment, if you'd like, to connect with the group by introducing yourself in the chat, um, sharing your name, maybe where you're joining from, if you'd like, and maybe a few words about what draws you to join the program here today. We're really delighted to be offering this program. It's intended in preparation for a Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is this Wednesday, and really so delighted that we've had such a great response to this program, and look forward to it being a meaningful one for everyone who's here today. I'm going to introduce our teacher for today, Dr. Joy Ladin, who is the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. That's Yeshiva University in New York. And Joy is the author of Once Out of Nature, Selected Essays on the Transformation of Gender, which is a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Through the Door of, no, the next book is the National Jewish Book Award finalist. That's Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders. A Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, and 11 books of poetry, including, most recently, Family, Shekhinah Speaks, and National Jewish Book Award winner, The Book of Anna, and her writing is available at joylayden.wordpress.com. And we are all blessed and privileged to have the opportunity to learn from Joy today. And I'm just so happy to welcome everyone as you're arriving. And with that, I will also thank Rachel Hugot, who's going to be holding the tech space for today's session, and my colleague Firkins Reed, who helped organize this program and create the space for everybody to practice today. So without further ado, turning it over to you, Joy. Thank you so much for leading us today.
Thank you, Mark. I love the way my nervous system starts to calm down as soon as Mark starts talking. Um, and it hasn't been calm very much lately, so
I
even
wish
more
that happened for
appreciate.
me too.
You need your own Mark. Uh, I'm so grateful and delighted for all of to see all of you here, and thank you so much for taking this time. Um, I'm going to introduce my plan for the whole event, and then sort of try to move through the different steps. But we'll see where we get to. If we don't get to everything, you'll at least know what the plan was. um, so Mark and I developed this event in the before times, before the election, and at the time. I was thinking of it as an event that would translate some of the work that I try to do in Once Out of Nature, the new collection of essays, into some mindfulness practices that could be useful in a couple of different ways. And so it was going to serve several purposes. One was, of course, spreading the word about the book. Let's be honest here. Um, But in relation to Transgender Day of Remembrance, I wanted to share work that highlighted and hopefully exemplified one of the ambitions of the book, which is to show how trans lives and trans experience and trans identities, instead of thinking of them as something that is either separate from every other way of being human, every other way of doing gender, or as something that is in conflict with other ways of doing gender, right? So there's a way of thinking about trans and non-binary identities, and some trans and non-binary people celebrate this, like the queerness. It's like we are just different. Think about everything you know about yourself, and then we're different from that. That is fine. But I didn't, I wanted to offer an alternative to that. And I also wanted to offer an alternative to what has become a very bitter and I think even nationally destructive discourse that says you can either include trans and non-binary identities, or you can have traditional gender, binary gender, everybody is male and female. You can tell that based on people's bodies. These are essences, they don't change, right? Many people live gender that way. And nobody wants to give up their way of doing gender. I don't certainly don't. That's the whole thing about coming out as trans, right? I don't want to give up my way of doing gender. I don't want anybody else to feel like, well, Joy's here. Now I have to give up my way of doing gender. I don't want that either. So I wanted in the book to offer alternative ways of thinking about trans and non-binary identities and how they relate to other ways of being human. And for Trans Day of Remembrance, I wanted to highlight aspects of trans lives that offer, that illuminate just what it is to be human, that offer ways for everybody to understand something more about who they are as human beings. Um, so that instead of thinking trans and non-binary identities, special interest group, taking away from other people, or what a pain, and now we need another bathroom, that kind of stuff, instead, seeing the value of these differences because for the selfish reasons of, wow, you guys, because you guys are different, I get to learn something about myself that I might not have otherwise seen. That is, by the way, also kind of what God charters Jews as being in the Torah, right? People will look at the ways you're different, and they will learn better ways to conduct their own lives and governments. So trying to sneak a little of that stuff in there. Um, since the election, I have felt like there's another layer of that. Um, I think it is pretty clear that we're facing a radical restructuring of government along much more authoritarian lines. And one of the things about authoritarianism is that it aims to change the way people think, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about others. And that means mindfulness, which is great for so many different reasons, including lowering blood pressure and increasing general compassion, also becomes a way of stabilizing ourselves and our values in a world that is really putting us under pressure to think in different kinds of ways. And so these exercises, I believe, also have something to say about that. Um, if all goes well, I'm going to start out, I'm going to be reading an excerpt from one of the essays that will hopefully lead into the questions about binaries and the terms we think about other people in. We'll have about 10 minutes in breakout groups. Then we'll share a little bit when we come back. And then I will read another excerpt that leads into the questions about we'll have breakout groups, we'll have a discussion, and we'll be done. And I just want to say the idea here is that one of the things about authoritarianism is it is very important to reduce people's range of thinking and range of understanding. And one of the great ways to do that is to encourage or trigger people into thinking in binary terms. You're either us or you're them. You're with us or you're against us. You're this or you're that. You have only two choices. One of them is clearly wrong, and the other is clearly right. So trying to reduce the dimensions in which we see other people, instead of seeing them as rich, messy, complicated people, we put them into either of two boxes, and trying to encourage us to do that with ourselves too. Oh my goodness, this regime will see me as them, not as us. How do I deal with that, right? So developing habits where we become aware of how we think, the terms in which we think of ourselves and other people, hopefully will enable us to maintain a breadth and expansiveness of thought regarding ourselves and other people. The second exercise in terms of thinking about um, authoritarianism puts our sense of ourselves under a great deal of pressure. And in more advanced states of authoritarianism, it makes it hard for people. That's something I personally know very well. It makes it hard for people. We become distrustful. We become afraid of being ourselves. We've become afraid of presenting ourselves as who we are because we're afraid that that will get us labeled as the wrong kind of person and we become targeted. And so our eye splits into multiple eyes. We start having an eye that's in the closet, that's our real self, and then we have an eye that's a public eye that we think, well, this is an edited version of me, this is safe under these circumstances. And, for some of us, we're very accustomed to living that way, but for a lot of us, that can be quite shocking. So again, these exercises, I think, can give us a little practice in managing that and maintaining a sense of who we are. Okay, so now I'm going to read a little bit from the title essay of the book called Once Out of Nature, Reflections on Body, Soul, Gender, and God. And it has an epigraph. This is the best writing in the piece, I have to warn you. It's from Yeats, Sailing to Byzantium. Yeats writes, "Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling. One summer, I promised myself that I wouldn't miss a sunset. I'd set out on foot along my suburban street toward the blaze of molten gold limning our small local mountain. I wasn't far from farmland. Half a mile away, a little used dirt road threaded fenced-off passengers of profoundly uninterested cows. If I walked far enough, on the right-hand side, I'd come to a grass-fringed mud hole dug to water cattle, and if I was lucky, glimpse a great blue heron or thrumming bullfrog. This was nature, I would think, real nature, whose wings still beat in the mountain's lengthening shadow. But was it? The herons were only here on account of the mud hole, and the mud hole was dug out to give domesticated cattle access to water. My decision to label part of the scene real nature was a romantic simplification, a projection of human categories onto the unsubdivided sprawl of life. There's nothing natural about our notions of nature. Nature is a human category, a construct that reflects our longing to define our place in the universe we simultaneously inhabit and conceive. Despite, During my open-mouthed awe at the startled heron's flight, nature meant an order human beings may witness, protect, or despoil, but necessarily stand outside, because nature is defined in opposition to us. But the idea of nature also grounds our conceptions of humanity. People seem natural to us when they reflect what we oxymoronically call human nature, our sense of how people are and should be. My gender is a mudhole, a willful remixing of physical and human nature that defies separation into neat categories like male and female, natural and artificial, challenging the idea that these categories are mutually exclusive, that we can clearly, conclusively distinguish them at all. That perhaps is why some people react so violently to folks like me. We are mirrors in which they see the artificiality of the natural binary of male and female, its incompleteness, its inadequacy, the contradictions it simplifies. I understand that anger. I spent most of my life longing to be, as the song says, a natural woman. But the longer I live as my true self, as a woman whose every female X chromosome is invariably paled with a Y, and who was born and bred male, the happier I am to live outside of nature. I am what I am, and I do what I do without fretting about how I fit or conflict with natural ideas about a woman should be or do. It can be cold and dangerous outside the gender binary, but you can't beat the view of the gloriously messy, category confounding universe. But you don't have to be trans to experience dissonance between the bodies we are told naturally define us and the sense of self we refer to whenever we say I. We see this when the aging speaker of Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium declares, "Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing." Like me, Yeats' speaker is dismayed by the mismatch between body and soul. But Yeats' speaker goes much further than I have, rejecting not only his bodily form, but nature itself. The speaker tells us he looks forward to spending eternity in such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling. Specifically, he says he wants to be a mechanical bird, which is an example of how poets say really goofy things that sound really good. But we're not going to go there. Becoming artifice rather than natural thing, he believes, will enable him to sing of what is past or passing or to come without actually having to suffer through history. So he's writing that because he's old. But I think many of us know those feelings of our bodies don't actually reflect who we are, and we wish that there was some way to get outside the tsuris of being embodied and being in history. From the outside, gender reassignment can seem artificial, superficial, a silly insistence that the trivial nouns and verbs of gender, suits and skirts, tones of voice, arcs of arm and swings of hip, and, God help us, makeup, have existential importance. But Yeats considered artifice the ultimate expression of self. And when I began the gender reassignment process, I realized how stunted my artifice-starved female gender identity was. My male persona was just that, a persona, a conscious attempt driven by fear and shame to look and act the way others wanted me to be. Everything, from my personal taste to my morality, was a mask, a way of hiding who I really was. As a result, when I began living my female gender identification full time, when I started living as a woman, I couldn't answer basic questions about who I was because I'd spent my life avoiding them. Was I the kind of woman who wears scarves, climbs mountains, belly dances, runs for public office? I didn't know. Like anyone learning a new language, I needed to master the basics of femininity, to learn how to dress, talk, and move through the world as a woman before I could attempt any grander statement about who I was or wanted to be. The artifice of gender reassignment. And by the way, I was comforted when I started looking at, like, as I would walk by junior high school playgrounds, I thought, oh, all of those girls, they're doing the same thing I am here. They're trying to figure it out and learn this language too, so they can figure out who they're going to be. The artifice of gender reassignment, the changes in my physical appearance and social presentation, enabled me after 40 plus years to finally see myself in the mirror. But gender reassignment also enabled me to step outside the mirror, to walk away from the compulsive, self-defeating cycles of introspection through which I, like so many trans people, kept trying to determine whether my sense of gender identity was real, was true, was indeed my identity and not, as most of the world insisted, delusion, impossibility, sexual fetish, or mental illness. The artifice that identified me to others as a woman was to me a crucial expression of selfhood, a means of embodying and making visible my disembodied, invisible sense of self. It enabled me to speak as myself, write as myself, teach as myself, care for my children as myself, suffer, endure, and love as myself. But I was and am still uncomfortable with knowing that my identity, like all human identity, is not the revelation of some natural self, but an act of self fashioning, choice, artifice, imagination. I grew up imagining that others, unlike me, really were the boys and girls, men and women they appeared to be, that their identities weren't identities at all, but natural, unchanging essences. And so it came as a shock to me to discover when I began the transition process that my identity was so mutable, I could refashion it in a matter of moments. Because my height is within female norms, I could walk into a single stall bathroom as one gender and emerge in a moment or two later as another. For the couple of years, I commuted back and forth across the gender binary, sometimes several times a day. It was magical but spooky. All my life, I'd thought of gender as natural law, to be circumvented only through divine or arduous medical intervention. Now I saw that both my male persona and my female true self could fit within the same shoulder bag. There are two kinds of people in this world: people who fit binary categories, like male and female, natural and unnatural, and so on, and people like me, who don't. Actually, although the gender binary's defenders would argue with me, I don't think I've ever met anyone who perfectly, constantly, essentially fits binary categories. We're all too complicated, and binary categories are too simple. But it's human nature to sort non-binary phenomena, particularly messy, complicated phenomena that scare us, into binary categories. It's natural for human cultures to ensconce binaries as the cornerstones of worldviews and value systems. And it's natural for human psyches to cling to and defend binary categories when confronted with people like me who confound them. And by the way, this includes me. Like, I think I'm over the binary gender thing, but when I get anxious, I am immediately sorting everything into binary categories. Um, but however natural though binaries that we're accustomed to may seem, binary categories are as artificial as the binary ones and zeros of computer language. If you look hard enough at any aspect of nature, you'll find things that defy the either ors of binary classification. The binary categories of life and death, for example, seem to cover all the possibilities. But people who study viruses and EMTs trying to revive heart attack victims can testify that there's a whole spectrum of crowded murk between them. The interminable American debate over abortion is another example that demonstrates how desperate we are and how futile it can be to try to reduce humanity to binary categories like fetus and person. To truly recognize transgender people as human beings, we have to shatter the idol of binary gender and face the truth that trans people embody. Binaries represent neither the nature of nature nor the nature of humanity. However radical this may sound, this truth is as down to earth as my mud hole, where without fuss or fanfare, binary human categories collide, collapse, and coalesce into more capacious, messier forms, where bullfrogs thrum amphibious hymns under gliding great blue herons, where someone who lives as a woman after a lifetime as a male whispers, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," to a God who knows all about human gender and couldn't care less. Mm. So, what I'd like to invite you to do in a second, we're going to break you into breakout rooms, discussion groups, and I'd like you to consider um, either the first two exercises on the list some binaries you use to define, choose one of the binaries, or if your group is like, oh, I hate that question, you're welcome to do the the next two, list some terms in which you identify yourself, and if you could snap your fingers. Either one of those is good. And then we'll come back, and since we are a wonderfully large group, only be able to hear a couple of reports back from the breakout groups. But I'm looking forward to that. So have an awesome time. I wish I could eavesdrop on all of you. Um, um, I'm going to just quickly address Susan's wonderful question. Um, those are binaries that are inscribed in our tradition, but I don't see them actually as much of a problem because um, Shabbat and a lot of other major Jewish transitions happen at twilight, which is the primordial non-binary time. When is twilight exactly? And so that we invent things. And when is Shabbat over? It's not over at the binary night, day and night. That should be easy. If day and night is a binary, if reality is a binary, it's either day or it's night. It should be easy. We shouldn't have to look for three stars and say, wait, oh no, that one's moving. It's a plane. And that one's a planet. Does a planet count? I wish I had a rabbi here to ask. Right. Yeah. So it doesn't trouble me. In fact, in Judaism, there are many places where you can see binaries as being complemented rather than contradicting non-binary ways of thinking. You know how Jews are. It's not either or, it's and um, often in our tradition. So that is a great discussion to have. But I want to try to um, I'm going to read the next piece in hopes that we can make Rena's wish come true and have longer breakout groups next time. But I want to encourage, so I can't respond to the excellent comments that are coming up in the chat. So I would like to encourage other people to keep that conversation going. Um, I'm going to read an excerpt from another essay called Emily Dickinson and I. I made my way across the frozen lawn of the Emily Dickinson homestead to the Amherst Women's Club and squeezed myself into one of the last seats left in a large oval of people who braved the bitter January cold to explore the shortest, most frequently used, and most important word in Emily Dickinson's poetic lexicon, I. I had solid academic reasons for discussing this. The I in Dickinson's poem seems both utterly idiosyncratic and uncomfortably familiar. Few of us introduce ourselves as one of Dickinson's speakers does by saying, I am alive, I guess, but many of us have muttered something like it to ourselves. Her I is simultaneously a self-abasing nobody and a confident exemplar of Shelley's vision of the poet as a legislator of reality, effortlessly inverting, subverting, and rewriting the terms of life, death, soul, God, and eternity. But I also had a more personal stake in the subject. I hope that our explanation of Dickinson's first-person pronoun would teach me what I meant, what I could mean by mine. In the 1990s, when I first introduced myself to a group of fellow Dickinson geeks, my I referred to Jay, a male persona I created to hide my female gender identity, someone I both was and wasn't, a body and biography that never felt like mine. My I also referred to the ironic consciousness hiding behind and pulling the strings of my male persona. This is the closeted I that I was talking about, and that in conditions of established authoritarianism, everybody is always partly in the closet. So you have that kind of an I. Um, this binary I was remarkably stable. I lived that way for decades. But my two I's whirled around one another in irresolvable cycles of self-doubt. Was I my lived male persona or my unlived female gender identity? Or perhaps the whirl of doubt, the consciousness of my inability to establish a coherent sense of self? Now that I live as a woman, my I refers neither to a persona nor to ironic distance, but to me, Joy, my true self. But as I was reminded during pre-discussion chit-chat, when one participant, who'd taken a class I taught years ago as a man, introduced herself to me as though we'd never met, it's still not clear what it means when I say I, whether I'm concealing, reconciling, or heightening the contradiction between my past persona and my present self. In other words, does my I refer to who I was, or who I am, or some kind of combination of the two? Or should I just be like Mel and say, I'm beyond all that? That sounds marvelously postmodern, but I'd be a lot more comfortable if I knew more about what, or maybe how, my I means. No matter what existential wildernesses I wander, I count on Emily Dickinson to have been there and done that, to have written poems that provide pungent, precise language for what seems to me unspeakably confusing and mysterious. I don't think Dickinson was trans, but the speakers in her poems, like many trans people, tend to locate themselves along margins and boundaries, at home while everyone else is in church, dying while everyone else is alive, bemusedly embarking on the interminable carriage ride toward immortality, rather than simply being alive or dead. Instead of withdrawing because they don't fit the usual social slots, Dickinson's marginal speakers plant themselves at the center of our attention, forcing us to make sense of what they mean by I. I wanted to learn to say I like that, but couldn't see how to translate the power of Dickinson's poetic I into my daily life. It would have been socially and pedagogically disastrous to explain to my former student that she had indeed met me before, when, as I would say if I was one of Dickinson's speakers, I was afraid to own a body and afraid to own my soul. But unlike me, Dickinson's speakers are confident that we will do the work of figuring out what they mean by I, as we hear in this famous poem. And don't be scared, a lot of Dickinson's poems, I'm clueless about what she's saying, but this is one that is taught in grade school. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. My daughter used to recite that when she was 3. It was the cutest thing in the world. I wish I'd recorded it. Um, as the class noticed, the informal opening of the poem, I'm, immediately made us feel close to the speaker. The word nobody heightened our sense of intimacy by sounding like an honest, vulnerable confession of a lack of social status that most of us would try to hide when introducing ourselves to strangers, right? Your elevator pitch should not start out by saying, I'm nobody. But I'm nobody also erases the speaker's biographical self, like the self, the actual data of who the speaker is, turning I from a sign of identity into a sign of lack of identity, a lack that the speaker embraces as an identity. I'm the I that doesn't have an identity, and that's my identity. Though I didn't share this with the group, the self-erasing definition, I'm nobody, crystallizes what I meant by I when I was living as a man. I referred to my consciousness that I had no visible lived identity, no place in the social order, no way to name myself except by negation. What I was really saying was, I'm not a man. Who are you? I would never have voiced this self-definition, would never have turned I'm nobody from ashamed self-awareness into a declaration of identity. But the speaker of I'm nobody is the opposite of ashamed. The speaker seems to equate being nobody with what one of Dickinson's letters calls a representative self, a self with which others can identify, as we can tell from the speaker's cheerful invitation to whoever is reading the poem to join the I'm Nobody bandwagon. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Everyone in that class accepted this invitation. And actually, every time I've taught in this poem, every participant has accepted the invitation. Happily identifying as nobody and joining the speaker in inverting the social hierarchy by redefining being nobody as an exclusive social club. Then there's a pair of us, don't tell, from which we could look down on all the self-promoting somebodies. In severing the link between I and social identity by identifying as nobody, the speaker had staged a small-scale coup, establishing a rhetorical state 2 quatrains long that offers citizenship to anyone willing to renounce their identifications with social categories and hierarchies. As we pulled on our coats, I thought about what Dickinson had taught me, that I can use I to signify a nobody self that doesn't fit existing terms and social categories, that my I could represent not a definite somebody, but a process of self-definition, and that by proudly embracing being nobody, I could, for a moment or two at least, upend the usual ways of deciding who is who matters, and who doesn't. What, I wondered, would I mean the next time I said, I'm joy? So, thank you. We're again going to go into breakout groups. And I think we can do that comfortably until 3. I'm sorry, I skated over sharing, but then when we come back from breakout groups, we'll devote the rest of our time together to sharing, and I can stay till 1/2 past the hour if anybody wants to do that, and anybody who needs to leave before that, of course, can. So how about a 13-minute breakout group? Welcome back, everyone. And I know that still wasn't long enough because yeah, I threw a lot of questions at you, and you all look like you were going to wrestle with them. So sorry about that, but I mean the questions to be available to you to think about as needed and to invite other people to think about with you. Because as I said when I started, I think that in addition to my uh, hope that these questions will help everybody think of trans and non-binary people not as some strange them, but as a part of an us that everybody can learn from. I also think that under authoritarianism, we're going to need um, to be able to think in these ways and keep straight how we're thinking about ourselves and others. Now, I would like to invite people to report back from your breakout sessions, and it can be either one. And we're just going to have the rest of the time. I would love to, yeah, think organizing, continuing. This is awesome. I am easily accessible through my website. I put that information in the chat. So yeah, let's keep it going. If you would like to report back anything from your breakout sessions, make sure it's not something that people have said is confidential, of course. Then just do the raise hand thingy, because I can only see a fraction of people.
Danny.
I think I'm answering the wrong question, so I'll just take the moment then to say thank you. This was really extraordinary. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Danny, but you don't have, I'm not, right, wrong, that's a binary. You sure you don't want to throw out whatever you were going to say?
Um, I just, I just struggle with the whole notion of gender. Personally, I'm a trans man, but I just finished reading the book that you introduced here today, and I deeply appreciate the sense of being able to contain binaries within oneself, even if one chooses to identify or one must identify as a particular binary. I found that really liberating and it took away some pain.
I'm so glad. There's way too much pain, and anything we can do to around gender and anything we can do to reduce that is good. And I think one of the things that I hope we all recognize, and we can start paying attention to it. It's not something you just have to know. You can pay attention. I think we will all, Walt Whitman said, am I not large? I contain multitudes. Um, whatever. I don't know about containing multitudes. I'm always trying to lose weight, but um, but I think that when we pay attention to ourselves, what we see is that that it is easy for us, it is natural for us, and it is inevitable for us to be different versions of ourselves in different contexts, right? My children, who I am to my children is not who I am at work. Who I am at work is not who I am with my best friend. It was one of the things that was so brutal about the pandemic, right? When we were sheltering in place and we were just kind of compressed into, we didn't have all of those different places where we could be different aspects of ourselves, and Zoom was not a sufficient way to do it. So one way that for people who are trans and non-binary, we have to learn this stuff with gender because it is so uncomfortable trying to make sense of ourselves in terms of binary categories. But I think all of us can learn this just because this is a normal aspect of being human. And in fact, I think the reason that identities and essential identities are so important to us, and I say this as somebody who spent my life like this is my true self, right? I said that is because we're so many different things at different times. So to balance that, we also want to have a sense of true self, of who we really are, or as my trauma therapist said, our core selves, which I think is really good. A good way to think about it. Ellis? I'm sorry, we need you to unmute, Ellis.
Um, yeah, just keeping things simple. I'm trying to understand why we even bother differentiating between sexual orientation. So I'm heterosexual. So what? Big deal. Somebody else is trans. Somebody else is gay. What difference does it make? Well, does that mean that heterosexualism is normal and everything else is less normal? I don't see it that way. Whatever your sexual orientation is, it's in your head. Do what you want in your own bedroom in your own sexual life, and let's get out there and live our lives together. Why the differentiation? To try to keep things simple.
I think that that is a wonderful question, Ellis, and I know that you're presenting it as a rhetorical question. You're saying, look, there's a way of just letting everybody be whatever they are at any given moment without labeling it or needing to make a big deal out of
No,
it.
but I'm saying, why are you different from me? I'm heterosexual. You may be trans. Big deal. Who cares? What difference does it make? It's in our heads. That's how we were born. Big deal. Why do we make a deal out of it?
And I think that there are a couple of reasons that we do, because it is a very good question. Why do we? I mean, I'm somebody who made a big deal out of it, right? I messed up my whole life because I made such a big deal out of it. So I would
Oh,
just like to respond to you.
right.
Some people, for one reason that people make a big deal out of it is because, as you pointed out, um, society as a whole makes a big deal out of some things. It says this is the right way to be, this is the wrong way to be. you get paid attention more to, we get paid attention less to. If we see you as a woman, we're going to pay you less than if we see you as a man. So for some of us who are seen as a particular thing, kind of person who is different and lesser, we don't really have a choice because the meaning that it has is imposed on us. We have to be aware of it, whether or not we want to be, because other people are thinking of us this way. Another reason that it can matter to people is, as I was saying somewhere, people want to be seen and recognized. It's a basic human need that many of us have. And I think it's a basic human need that is balanced against what Ellis is pointing out, because I think it's also a basic human need to want people to want to be free to be all of who we are. And if we're all of who we are, we're not going to fit into these boxes. So these are contradictory needs, and I think we have them both at once. If you identify as heterosexual or homosexual, those identities can be really helpful in finding the people that you want as romantic partners. If people can't recognize you this way, then they can't, they're not going to seek you out and find you, right? It's why when we go out to a bar and we're hoping that we can meet somebody and stuff like that, we often pay a whole lot of attention to how we're presenting ourselves so that we attract the right kind of people and hopefully we don't attract the wrong kind of people. So there are a lot of reasons why we sometimes want to be seen as this, that, or the other thing. But as Ellis reminds us, we also have a need to be all of who we are, and all of who we are can't fit into any of those boxes that we sometimes need. Micah?
So I'm a trans man and I'm also an anthropologist.
Perfect.
They're probably laughing at me for introducing myself this way. But I actually got into anthropology because I found myself as a child and teenager studying people around me so much for how do I present myself to give the impression of my internal state to the outside world. And a conversation I'm having with a lot of younger LGBTQ, queer, trans people is this question of labels, not just even outside of binary, but a label is a way to frame our identity to other people. And there's so much anxiety about picking the right label. And am I allowed to change labels later? And all this other, And I think an aspect of all this coming together for me was realizing that labels are not necessarily a box, because then you end up with non-binary as a third gender, which is not anything that most people intend when they say they're non-binary. They're breaking away from it entirely. Like, it's not a third gender, it's something else entirely. And so I always encourage people to think of labels like heterosexual or transgender as tools. They're communication tools. It's a shorthand, and you can change that at any given moment. It's not that they're relevant, be all, end all definitions of who we are. It's that it is a way to communicate. And in that way, language and gender are both fluid. And so I find that aspect in relation to the Jewishness of identity can be an internal state that we are sharing with the outside world, that we can share through that Emily Dickinson I, but it's also the divine I of this is unencompassable. So let me get one or two phrases that maybe get the gist of it across.
Thank you, Micah. When I was in college, my social science teachers wanted me to go to grad school for this, and I felt like, number one, I was so associated and everything, I knew that that would be bad. But number two, I felt like this is shooting fish in a barrel for me. I've been doing this my whole life because I have to keep studying gender in order to survive and understand it. I wanted to throw out something different though. I've come to think of identities and all kinds of identities as having three different parts, three different aspects that work together. If you have a fully functional social identity, You have a self-identification. You say, I am whatever, you use those labels, and those you have complete freedom with. It's self-identification. My ex, for example, who was not pleased about my gender transition, said, so if you identify as a chicken, does that mean I should start treating you as a chicken? And, I can identify as a chicken. The only problem that arises is the question of who I am in relation to others. So we have complete freedom of self-identification. And as Micah is rightfully reminding all of us, that is fluid because we keep changing. Human beings are dynamic or messy. We contain multitudes. We don't have to choose between this, or as Ellis would say, we don't have to choose to just be this or just be that. In the privacy of our own minds, we have absolute freedom. As I've often said, I like to identify as a Nobel Prize winner. The problem with my self-identification comes when I want other people to see me as a Nobel Prize winner, because I have not in fact won a Nobel Prize. So I can be a legend in my own mind, but if a fully functional social identity also depends on how others see us. And that becomes a lot less fluid. In fact, in relationships, some people, and I think these are the great relationships, they're people who just love us and they give us maximum space to be who we are. Although even those people, I think, have their limits. But really the best love is the love that just lets people be whoever they happen to be at any given moment. But your bank teller doesn't really want you to be whoever you are at any given moment. They want you to be who your identity documents say you are. And if you're not, or if you're behaving in ways that call that into question, they are not going to give you your money. They're not going to do it. This also is the case when you're on a first date. If during that date you say, by the way, I might be completely different the next time I see you because I just happen to be identifying as this or that right now, but I have no way of predicting what I'm going to be next time. So other people want some stability in how they can see us and how they can relate to us. And the third part of an identity, so you've got total freedom of self-identification, how other people see us, which we don't control. And we don't have freedom to just jerk people around with it. And then the third part of it is, this identity that we have, is there any way to live that identity? So there were people, for example, who had become lawyers. They passed the bar exam right before the pandemic. And but they couldn't practice law because everything was shut down. So they identified as lawyers, other people identified them as lawyers, but they couldn't actually be lawyers. So they did not have a complete socially functional identity. It is normal for us to have incomplete or socially not totally functional identities. Our self-identifications change in ways that don't go with how other people see us. We start identifying, I don't want to be a teacher anymore. I actually want to go raise cattle, but I have a job as a teacher, so I can't live my cattle raising identification, right? It's not uncommon for these to be out of alignment. And there are a variety of sucky ways that we often feel. These are trans experiences when those parts don't align with one another. When they do more or less align, we have a more or less complete identity that works for us. But it's kind of like the weather in New England. If you don't like the weather right now, wait an hour or two, right? If you think your identity is all working right now, just wait a little while and life will get in the way with it. So that's the way I've come to see it. All right, I think the order is Margaret and Elle and Patricia.
I would like to offer a poem by John Clare, and it's a great sonnet called I Am. And as you know, he was the son of an agricultural laborer and an illiterate mother, not supposed to be a poet. He's one of the great nature poets. In England, lived 1793 to 1864, spent quite a bit of time in an insane asylum from which he fled. And here his poem, I Am, which I think speaks to the universal aspects of all that you've been trying to share. He says, I feel I am. I only know I am and plod upon the earth as dull and void. Earth's prison chilled my body with its dram of dullness, and my soaring thoughts destroyed. I fled to solitudes from passion's green, but strife pursued. I only know I am. I was a being created in the race of men, disdaining bounds of place and time, a spirit that could travel o'er the space of earth and heaven, like a thought sublime, tracing creation like my maker, free, a soul unshackled like eternity, spurning earth's vain and soul debasing thrall. But now I only know I am. That's all.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think, Ellis, if you're looking for a sonnet that might encapsulate the way you're encouraging us to think about identity, that seems like the perfect one. Thank you. Al?
There we go. I was wondering if it's okay to ask a question of you, just to elaborate a little more on your work, which is so much about, and I think part of what we were grappling with was the fact that, you know, that Hebrew being a gendered language, and already in the chat, some folks were talking about the fact that, you know, we have a religious life that's sort of premised on this language that's gendered. And so much of your work is kind of about exploring, you know, the Bible and Jewish texts that are profoundly gendered in the way that they were originally constructed. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, like, what do you find yourself doing with that, trying to kind of like rethink it? I think a lot of what you're talking about is sort of relating to the idea of going beyond these categories, but when the categories are sort of so embedded in a historical text, you know, how do we make sense of it? Do we just keep it as an open question? Do we answer things provisionally? And sort of how do you find yourself navigating that as you try to think about your place within these texts?
Thank you. That is a huge question. We could do an entire workshop, or if not semester, on that question. So I'm just going to take a teensy part of it. I don't want to diminish the question. One of the things that, well, first of all, because I identify as female, there are some ways in which I like that stuff, right? Like the Shabbat candle mitzvah. I like it when it doesn't hurt me, and I don't like it when it does. So, do I contradict myself? Well, I contradict myself. There we go. I'm large. I contain multitudes. But one of the amazing things that I've come to see about what Jewish tradition does with gender is, because gender is grammatical gender is not the same as social gender, right? For example, all kinds of nouns have gender, and they don't particularly make sense. And if you compare the gender that a given thing has in this language with the gender it has in that language, what's going on? And then if you look at languages where they're not gendered at all, there's some languages that don't gender very much, and you look at the way that their society, they have very structured hierarchical gender. So there isn't a direct relationship between the gender that's embedded in a language and the way people have to live gender. It comes up with pronouns, it comes up with some other things, but really I think the issue for people for whom it is an issue is the social gender rather than the language gender. When people misgender me because they don't know, it doesn't really bother me. When people misgender me because they want to misgender me, that hurts. And I don't want to say everybody's like that. It can hurt anyway. If it hurts, it hurts. But if you look at the character of God in the Torah, the character of God is usually, but not always, associated with feminine case endings and verb forms and verb constructions. And, usually, but not always, often associated with male imagery or imagery we think of as male, but not always. And a lot of times it's described in terms of things that aren't human, so they don't have gender. God is my rock. Okay, is God a male rock, a female rock? Which the text doesn't say. So the image of God that you get is this is a being who is beyond gender and beyond humanity, and who we relate to in terms of these kinds of categories. So if you're actually thinking about God, and Maimonides doesn't talk about gender because he's so profoundly sexist, not to say misogynist, but he really is absolute that anybody who reads the Torah anthropomorphically, that is, as reading God as fitting into any of the categories that the Torah invites you of God's right hand. Thinks anybody who thinks God has a right hand because the Torah refers to God's right hand is a moron. And he's even condescends, gotta love Maimonides, to the Torah, because it's like, yeah, the Torah had to do this for the people who weren't at a sufficiently elevated level, but really this kind of language gets in the way of God. So I think for really religious people, if we really want to have a relationship with God, and the God you see in the Torah is not busy performing gender, I don't know what gender it is to speak out of thunder and lightning. Certainly not the way any guy I've ever met talks. And I'm running in the other direction if some guy starts talking like that. So none of that fits within social gender. And so, to me, traditional Judaism gives us an ongoing exercise in the recognition of someone who is a real someone who really exists, but who exists beyond and before and behind all of these kinds of terms, and who uses them kind of the way Ellis was talking about, for convenience, for relationship. When God says, I'm speaks like a king, that's for the relationship. It doesn't mean God is going to stand around, holding court with courtiers, right? So we can use categories and terms for our relationships without confusing ourselves with them. And we can practice relating to somebody who doesn't fit those categories and terms by having a relationship with the divine that is beyond them. I'm not saying that's easy, but it is what Jewish tradition invites us to do. And that's that's Maimonides, Orthodox reading. Pia?
There. Thank you. I was thinking of this earlier, but a lot of what you've been saying in this last little bit also connects. And the idea of the perception and performance of the binary as culturally shaped and the cultures that don't shape that. So I have recently, because it's Native American Heritage Month and I work in healthcare, been part of a number of workshops and webinars around Native American perceptions of disability in healthcare. And Native American culture, none of the Native American cultures or languages on the North American continent have a word for disability. They do not have that concept. And I'm thinking of the parallels where they have two-spirit, and we think here in our Eurocentric perspective that two-spirit is transgender, but it's not. It may or may not be transgender. It may or may not be non-binary. That it's more nuanced, more complicated than that. And their idea of disability is similarly, they have to perform disability when they enter our Eurocentric culture to receive and access the services and supports that our culture will provide only if you perform it successfully according to various criteria. But within their culture, lacking more of the binary concepts, it's more contextual, where each person is an individual. And we are not thinking this is, an identity. It's thinking that, one of the things that really struck me is that they see each person who is trans or two-spirit or disabled, any of what we think of as boundary-breaking identities. They see them as having been gifted extraordinary spiritual insight and lessons of insight to carry into their community. And thinking of it that way, and then thinking of the Jewish perspective and how this is changing as Judaism continues to evolve, and how we as a people and an identity continue to evolve. So I'm just caught in the flow of all of these ideas, and thank you for contributing to that flow.
Thank you. We're about to close, and I think that is a wonderful place to end. Not that I want to end. Thank you so much for all of you for coming and for contributing and for hanging in there to the end over time. Oh, yes. Laaya, do you want to quickly see if you can sneak that in? I lost your hand. I lost sight of your hand for some reason.
Yes, I
friends.
can briefly talk. Um, it was amazing to listen to this gathering, and it really made me think about two things. First of all, that even though those things which are not non-binary aren't binary either. So that's like a spectrum of spectrums. So like there's male, female, and non-binary, but at the same time, the not non-binary aren't binary either, because there's a whole plurality in things. And the other thing is that specifically about AI plus people, there's this thing of historical pathologizing. And so because of this pathologizing, there's this jargon of psychiatry. So in psychiatry, you have to have very sharp definitions, which work in a kind of in a binary way. And so I think that there's this pressure to have these sharp labels as social markers of difference, because in actuality we're dealing with this history of those kind of idea that it is a pathology. And so rather than thinking about in terms of artistic labels, which would allow for more fluidity and for talking about things through metaphors or through ideas of approximations.
Thank you. That is fortunately also a wonderful place to end. And I want to throw out one other thing, which is another thing about binary gender is there are many forms of binary gender that we live among. There are religious forms and secular forms. I doubt that any of us here performs binary gender the way our grandparents did. And I can tell you, I don't perform binary gender the way my kids do, and they would be mortified if I did. So we all have experience in living in a world that is much more complex than binaries tell us. And that's why binaries are so comforting. Because sometimes we have it in us to embrace the complexity and the larger I, the Anochi, as Jewish tradition says, that it contains, that has no bounds. And sometimes we just really feel like we need bounds. And authoritarianism is going to keep pushing the anxiety buttons and encouraging us to fall back on those cognitive habits that bound us and bound other people. And I hope that we can all cultivate habits of self-awareness that enable us to resist inside, even when it feels too dangerous to resist outside. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.